Picture this. It's a crisp morning on a Hollywood movie set. Cameras are positioned perfectly. Crew members are buzzing around checking lights and sound equipment, and everyone's waiting for one of the biggest legends in cinema history to arrive. Clint Eastwood, the man who made westerns cool again, who directed masterpieces that won Oscars, who commanded respect just by walking into a room, is about to start filming a major studio production. But what's about to unfold over the next few hours will become one of the most talked about moments in Hollywood history, a story that'll spread like wildfire and ultimately bring a powerful studio executive to his knees. Stick with me, because what happens next isn't just Hollywood gossip. It's a masterclass in standing up for what's right, even when everyone tells you to just stay quiet and take the disrespect. Now, before we dive deep into exactly what went down on that set, and how Clint Eastwood's quiet but devastating response would end up costing a major studio millions of dollars and several careers, I need you to hit that subscribe button right now. This channel brings you the real stories behind Hollywood's biggest moments, the confrontations that never make it to the tabloids, and the lessons about integrity and courage that the entertainment industry desperately needs to remember. We're not here for shallow celebrity gossip. We're here for the stories that actually matter, the ones that show you how real power works and how one person standing firm on their principles can take down an entire corrupt system. All right, so let's set the scene properly, because understanding the context makes what happens later even more powerful. Clint Eastwood wasn't just some actor showing up for a paycheck. At this point in his career, he's a living legend. We're talking about a man who starred in the iconic Dollars trilogy, who gave us Dirty Harry, who won Academy Awards for directing Unforgiven and $1 Million Baby, who's been in this business for over 6 decades and has earned every ounce of respect his name carries. When Clint Eastwood signs onto your movie, you don't just get an actor or a director. You get credibility. You get audiences who'll show up because they trust his judgment. You get decades of expertise that can make a good film great. The film in question was supposed to be a prestige project for the studio, the kind of movie that gets talked about during award season. The budget was substantial, the script was solid, and having Eastwood attached meant this wasn't just another forgettable thriller. This was going to be an event. The studio executives were already counting their money, imagining the box office returns and the critical acclaim that would follow. Everything seemed perfect on paper, but there was a problem, and his name was Marcus Lieberman, the producer who'd been assigned to oversee the production. Now, Marcus was relatively new to producing at this level. He'd made his money in tech before transitioning into entertainment, and he had that Silicon Valley attitude where he thought traditional industries, like filmmaking, needed to be disrupted, and that old-school professionals were dinosaurs who didn't understand modern efficiency. You know the type. Guys who think because they made money in one field, they're automatically experts in everything else. Guys who confuse confidence with competence. Marcus had already rubbed several crew members the wrong way during pre-production. He'd questioned the cinematographer's camera choices, suggesting they used cheaper equipment. He'd pushed back on the production designer's budget, saying they could get similar results with less money. He'd even tried to reduce the number of shooting days, which would have meant rushing scenes that needed time and care. But the crew had dealt with difficult producers before, and they figured they could manage him. What nobody anticipated was that Marcus would decide to go after Clint Eastwood himself. The morning everything exploded started normally enough. Eastwood arrived at his usual time, and here's something important about Clint that you need to understand. The man is legendary for his professionalism. He shows up on time. He knows his lines. He doesn't waste anybody's time with nonsense or drama. He treats every crew member with respect, from the director of photography down to the production assistants getting coffee. He believes in efficient filmmaking, in getting quality shots without endless takes, in trusting the people around him to do their jobs well. That's how he's directed over 40 films and acted in dozens more without burning out or burning bridges. Also on set that morning was Gerald Whitmore, a 68-year-old character actor who'd been working in Hollywood for over 40 years. Gerald wasn't a household name, but he was exactly the kind of reliable professional that great films depend on. He'd appeared in hundreds of productions, always prepared, always delivering solid performances, always making everyone around him better. Eastwood had specifically requested Gerald for a supporting role because he'd worked with him twice before and knew he could trust him to nail his scenes. Think of Gerald as the kind of veteran player on a sports team who might not be the star anymore, but whose experience and steadiness keeps the whole team functioning smoothly. The scene they were shooting that morning involved a crucial conversation between Eastwood's character and Gerald's character, a moment that would set up the entire second half of the film. It required subtlety, precise timing, and the kind of chemistry that only comes from two seasoned professionals who understand their craft. The director had blocked out the scene, the camera operators were ready, the lighting was set perfectly, and everyone was prepared to capture something special. They ran through the first take, and it was good, really good. The director looked pleased, the script supervisor nodded approvingly, and the crew members who'd been doing this long enough to recognize quality work exchanged satisfied glances. They'd probably need just 2 or 3 takes to get exactly what they needed, maybe capture it from a different angle, and then they could move on efficiently, just the way Eastwood preferred to work. But then Marcus Lieberman strode onto the set with that aggressive energy that immediately made everyone tense. He'd been watching the take on a monitor in Video Village, and apparently he decided he needed to assert his authority. He walked right up to where Eastwood and Gerald were standing, didn't ask permission from the director, didn't wait for an appropriate moment, just interrupted the professional flow that a good set depends on. And here's where Marcus made his catastrophic mistake. Instead of offering constructive notes or asking questions respectfully, he decided to dress down Gerald Whitmore in front of the entire crew. He told Gerald his delivery was flat and lifeless, that his performance was something we'd expect from a community theater, not a major motion picture, and that maybe Gerald was too old and too tired to keep up with the demands of a real production. Let that sink in for a moment. This tech bro turned producer, who'd never acted a day in his life, who'd probably never even taken a drama class, was publicly humiliating a man with 4 decades of professional experience, questioning his ability, insulting his performance, and doing it all in the most disrespectful way possible. It's like if someone who just learned to cook last month started screaming at a chef who'd been perfecting their craft for 40 years, telling them they didn't know how to use a knife properly. The set went absolutely silent. Crew members froze in place, not knowing where to look. The director opened his mouth to intervene, but seemed too shocked to form words. Gerald's face flushed with embarrassment and hurt, but he stood there taking it because he was a professional, and because in Hollywood's power structure, producers have enormous authority even when they're completely wrong. But Marcus wasn't done. He turned to the director and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "We need to talk about recasting this role, because I'm not sure our friend here has what it takes to deliver what this film needs. Maybe we need someone with more energy, someone who actually shows up ready to work." That's when Clint Eastwood spoke up, and his voice was quiet but carried across the entire set with absolute clarity. He said, "Marcus, you need to apologize to Gerald right now, and then you need to leave this set." Marcus actually laughed, like he thought Eastwood was joking. He said something like, "Excuse me? I'm the producer of this film, and I'll say what needs to be said to get the performance we're paying for." Eastwood's expression didn't change, and if you know anything about Clint Eastwood, you know that his stillness is more intimidating than most people's anger. He said, "Gerald's performance was excellent. Your behavior is unacceptable. Apologize and leave, or I'm walking off this production right now." Now, Marcus made another huge miscalculation. He thought Eastwood was bluffing. He thought there was no way this legendary actor would actually walk away from a major studio film over a minor disagreement about another actor's performance. He thought he could call Eastwood's bluff and establish that he, the producer, was the real authority on this set. So Marcus crossed his arms and said, "Nobody's walking off this set. We have a contract, we have a schedule, and we have a film to make. Now let's reset and do another take with some actual energy this time." Clint Eastwood looked at Gerald, looked at the director, looked at the crew members who were all watching to see what would happen next, and then he did something that would become legendary. He calmly removed his microphone, handed it to the sound technician, thanked the crew for their professionalism, and walked off the set. Just like that. No yelling, no tantrum, no dramatic speech. He simply refused to participate in an environment where a veteran professional would be disrespected and humiliated. The set erupted into chaos. The director immediately called cut, and rushed after Eastwood. The assistant director started frantically calling studio executives. Crew members stood around in stunned disbelief, because shutting down production like this costs tens of thousands of dollars per hour. And Marcus Lieberman suddenly realized that maybe, just maybe, he'd made a serious error in judgment. But here's where the story gets even better, because what happened over the next 48 hours shows you exactly how power actually works in Hollywood, and what happens when you disrespect people who've earned genuine authority through decades of excellence. Within an hour of Eastwood walking off set, the studio executives received his formal letter explaining exactly why he'd left and what would need to happen before he'd return. And Eastwood didn't just demand that Marcus apologize. He demanded that Marcus be removed from the production entirely, that Gerald Whitmore receive a formal apology from the studio, and that protections be put in place, ensuring that no producer could unilaterally humiliate cast or crew members without consequence. He also made it clear that if these demands weren't met, he'd not only leave this production, but would also terminate his ongoing development deals with the studio, which represented several potential projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Now think about the position the studio executives found themselves in. On one hand, they had a relatively inexperienced producer who just torpedoed a major production by letting his ego overrule his common sense. On the other hand, they had Clint Eastwood, whose name on a project could mean the difference between a film that makes $50 million and one that makes $250 million, whose judgment and integrity were trusted by audiences worldwide, and who'd just drawn a clear line about what kind of behavior he'd tolerate. This wasn't really a difficult choice for the studio, but what makes it interesting is how they handled it and what it revealed about Hollywood's power structures. The studio president personally called Eastwood that evening. He apologized profusely, not just for Marcus's behavior, but for the studio having put someone in a position of authority who clearly wasn't ready for it. He explained that Marcus would be removed from the production immediately and would no longer work on any studio projects. He promised that Gerald Whitmore would receive both a personal apology from the studio's top executives and an enhanced role in the film as compensation for the humiliation he'd suffered. And he asked Eastwood what else would be needed to make this right. But Eastwood wasn't finished. He said he'd return to the production on 2 additional conditions. First, the studio needed to implement a new protocol where producers could offer notes and feedback, but couldn't publicly berate cast or crew members, with violations resulting in immediate removal. Second, the studio needed to issue a company-wide memo explaining what had happened and why Marcus had been terminated, so that everyone in the organization understood that no amount of money or connections would protect someone who treated people disrespectfully. The studio agreed to everything. They had no choice really, but here's what's important. They didn't just agree because Eastwood had leverage. They agreed because deep down, they knew he was absolutely right. Marcus Lieberman was fired the next morning. The studio sent out an internal memo that didn't name Marcus specifically, but made it very clear that the company had terminated a producer for creating a hostile work environment, and that leadership was committed to ensuring all productions maintain professional standards of respect. Gerald Whitmore received a call from the studio president apologizing for what had happened and thanking him for his professionalism. And Eastwood returned to set 2 days later to complete the film. But the story didn't end there, and this is where Marcus's arrogance came back to absolutely destroy him in ways he never could have anticipated. See, Marcus was furious about being fired. He felt humiliated. He felt like he'd been treated unfairly, and he decided he was going to fight back. He hired a high-powered entertainment attorney and threatened to sue the studio for wrongful termination, claiming he'd been fired without proper cause and that Eastwood had used his influence to blackball a rising producer who was just trying to maintain quality standards. He started giving interviews to entertainment media, spinning the story to make himself look like a victim of an out-of-control star who couldn't handle legitimate creative feedback. This was possibly the dumbest move Marcus could have made, and here's why. When you sue a major studio, they don't just defend themselves, they go to war. Their attorneys started investigating Marcus's entire tenure with the company. And guess what they found? A pattern of abusive behavior that went way beyond what happened with Gerald Whitmore. The studio's lawyers interviewed dozens of crew members from Marcus's previous productions. They found multiple complaints that had been filed with HR about his conduct. They found evidence that Marcus had berated a costume designer so badly she'd broken down crying on set. They found that he'd questioned a stunt coordinator's safety protocols in front of the whole team, undermining the coordinator's authority and potentially creating dangerous conditions. They found that he'd made inappropriate comments to several young female production assistants. They found email exchanges where Marcus bragged about putting people in their place and not letting the old guard hold back innovation. Armed with all this evidence, the studio didn't just defend against Marcus's lawsuit. They filed a countersuit alleging that Marcus had breached his contract by creating hostile work environments, that he'd exposed the studio to potential liability through his behavior, and that he owed them damages for the production delays and costs his conduct had caused. The case never made it to trial because Marcus's attorneys took one look at the mountain of evidence against him and told him he'd be destroyed if this went before a judge. Marcus quietly withdrew his lawsuit and signed a settlement agreement that included a non-disparagement clause, meaning he couldn't trash-talk Eastwood or the studio publicly. He essentially disappeared from Hollywood overnight. His brief producing career finished before it ever really began. But the ripple effects of what Eastwood had done went far beyond just one abusive producer getting what he deserved. Other studios started implementing similar protocols about how producers and executives could interact with cast and crew. Several prominent actors cited Eastwood's example when pushing back against disrespectful treatment on their own projects. Industry trade publications ran articles about the importance of maintaining professional environments and respecting the contributions of veteran crew members, whose experience was invaluable even if they weren't the flashiest names on the call sheet. And the film itself? It was completed on schedule, came in under budget because Eastwood's efficient directing style more than made up for the 2-day delay, received strong critical reviews, performed solidly at the box office, and featured a particularly praised performance from Gerald Whitmore that reminded everyone why experienced character actors are the backbone of quality filmmaking. Now let's talk about why this story matters beyond just one satisfying example of a jerk getting what he deserved, because there's some really important lessons here that apply whether you're working in Hollywood or anywhere else. First lesson: respect is earned through consistent professionalism, not demanded through positional authority. Marcus Lieberman thought that because he had the title of producer, he could treat people however he wanted. But Clint Eastwood had actual authority, the kind that comes from 60 years of showing up, doing excellent work, and treating people right. When those two types of power collided, real authority won every single time. It's like if a substitute teacher tried to boss around the principal. The title on paper doesn't mean much when everyone knows who actually deserves respect. Second lesson: standing up for others is sometimes more powerful than standing up for yourself. Eastwood didn't walk off that set because Marcus insulted him. Eastwood's ego could have handled that just fine. He walked off because Marcus disrespected Gerald Whitmore, a hard-working professional who deserved better. That kind of solidarity, that willingness to use your power to protect people with less power, that's what real leadership looks like. And it's exactly why everyone on that set and throughout the industry supported Eastwood afterward. Third lesson: short-term thinking leads to long-term disaster. Marcus was so focused on asserting his authority in that moment, on showing everyone that he was the boss, that he couldn't see how badly his actions would backfire. If he just treated Gerald with basic respect, if he'd offered notes constructively, if he'd understood that filmmaking is collaborative rather than dictatorial, he'd probably still be producing films today. Instead, his need to prove something in that moment destroyed his entire career. It's like studying for a test by cheating. You might pass that one test, but eventually you'll be exposed and everything will collapse. Fourth lesson: institutions will protect what's valuable to them, and people with genuine integrity become valuable in ways that go beyond immediate profit. The studio didn't back Eastwood just because his films made money, though that certainly helped. They backed him because his reputation for integrity made him a valuable long-term asset whose partnership was worth more than any single film. Meanwhile, Marcus represented only downside risk. He might save a few dollars here and there through aggressive cost-cutting, but his behavior exposed the studio to lawsuits, damaged productions, and reputational harm. When the math became clear, the choice was obvious. Fifth lesson: How you treat people when you have power over them reveals your true character. Marcus showed who he really was when he publicly humiliated Gerald Whitmore. Eastwood showed who he was when he stood up for Gerald, despite the personal cost and inconvenience. Those moments of choice, when you can either do the easy thing or the right thing, that's when your character gets tested, and everyone's watching to see what choice you make. The story also teaches us something crucial about how change happens in industries and organizations. One person standing firm on principle can create ripples that transform entire systems. Eastwood could have just rolled his eyes at Marcus's behavior, finished the film, and moved on. That would have been easier. But by drawing a hard line, by making it clear that certain behavior was unacceptable regardless of titles or contracts, he forced the studio to examine its practices and implement better protections. That's how progress happens, not through gradual passive improvement, but through moments when someone says enough and refuses to participate in broken systems. There's also something important here about the difference between creative feedback and personal attacks. Good producers, good directors, good collaborators of any kind can absolutely offer constructive criticism. They can say, "I think this line reading isn't quite hitting the emotional note we need," or "Could we try this scene with a different energy?" But there's a world of difference between that and what Marcus did, publicly questioning someone's fundamental competence and value. One approach makes the work better, the other just makes people feel terrible and creates toxic environments where everyone's too afraid to take creative risks. And let's talk about the practical implications for anyone working in any industry. You might not be Clint Eastwood with decades of leverage, but you can still learn from how he handled this situation. He didn't yell or make threats. He stated his position clearly, explained what would need to happen for him to continue, and then followed through on what he'd said he'd do. That kind of calm, clear boundary setting works, whether you're a Hollywood legend or someone just starting their career. You might not always win. Sometimes you'll lose the job or face consequences, but maintaining your integrity and standing up for what's right is worth it in the long run because it helps you build a reputation as someone trustworthy and principled. The Marcus Lieberman story also reveals something about a certain type of person who moves into creative industries from other fields and thinks their success elsewhere automatically translates. Having business acumen is valuable. Understanding efficiency matters. Bringing fresh perspectives can be helpful. But you can't just dismiss the expertise of people who've spent decades mastering their craft. You can't treat filmmaking like optimizing a software product, because you're working with human beings whose creativity and collaboration are what make the final product work. The best producers understand this balance. They bring organizational skills and business sense while deeply respecting the artistic process and the people who execute it. We should also recognize what the story says about age and experience in industries that often worship youth. Gerald Whitmore wasn't some washed-up actor taking up space. He was a seasoned professional whose experience made him more valuable, not less. But Marcus saw his age and assumed weakness, assumed obsolescence, assumed someone who could be pushed around. That's both morally wrong and practically stupid, because the veterans in any field have accumulated wisdom and skills that younger people simply haven't had time to develop yet. Smart organizations find ways to blend youthful energy with experienced judgment, not pit them against each other. There's another layer here about accountability and consequences. For too long, Hollywood tolerated abusive producers, directors, and executives because they made money or had connections. The whole #MeToo movement revealed how systemic this problem was. What Eastwood did, demanding real consequences for disrespectful behavior, represents the kind of accountability that's necessary for lasting change. It's not enough to shake your head disapprovingly at bad behavior. There have to be actual consequences, actual lines that can't be crossed without losing your position. And we have to acknowledge the courage it took for Eastwood to walk off that set. He was putting a major production at risk, potentially damaging his relationship with the studio, opening himself up to criticism that he was being difficult or unprofessional. He knew all that, and he did it anyway because some principles matter more than convenience. That's rare. Most people, even when they see something wrong happening, calculate whether speaking up is worth the personal cost. Eastwood's example reminds us that sometimes it absolutely is worth it. and that taking the risk can create outcomes you never could have achieved by staying silent. Let's also consider the impact this had on Gerald Whitmore personally. Imagine being publicly humiliated like that, having your competence questioned in front of dozens of colleagues, feeling that burning shame and helplessness. And then imagine Clint Eastwood, one of the biggest legends in cinema history, immediately standing up for you and refusing to continue until you received the respect you deserved. That probably meant more to Gerald than any paycheck or credit ever could. It validated his decades of work, it restored his dignity, and it sent a message to everyone watching that his contributions mattered. That's the kind of moment that people remember for the rest of their lives. The story also illustrates the limits of formal power versus informal power. Marcus had the formal power. His contract gave him authority over the production. His title gave him the right to offer feedback and make decisions. But Eastwood had informal power, the respect of his colleagues, the trust of audiences, the leverage that came from his proven track record, and the moral authority that came from his consistent integrity. When those two types of power collided, informal power won decisively. That's a lesson worth remembering. Titles and contracts matter, but respect and trust matter more in the long run. We should recognize, too, that the studio's response, while ultimately correct, probably wouldn't have happened if someone with less stature than Eastwood had raised the same concerns. If a production assistant or a day player had complained about Marcus, they likely would have been ignored or even punished. That's the unfortunate reality of power dynamics in most industries. But that's exactly why it's so important when people who do have power use it to protect those who don't. Eastwood could have just looked out for himself, but he used his leverage to create better conditions for everyone. That's what ethical leadership looks like. The financial dimensions of this story are worth considering too. When Eastwood walked off set, every moment of delay was costing the studio enormous amounts of money. Crew salaries, equipment rentals, location fees, all of it just burning through the budget while nothing productive happened. The studio could have tried to sue Eastwood for breach of contract, but they quickly calculated that they'd lose far more by fighting him than by giving him what he wanted. That's a calculation everyone should understand. Sometimes the expensive option of doing the right thing is actually far cheaper than the consequences of doing the wrong thing. And finally, this story is ultimately about the kind of culture we create in our workplaces and communities. Marcus created a culture of fear and disrespect, where people felt demeaned and anxious. Eastwood was fighting for a culture of mutual respect and professionalism, where people could do their best work without being arbitrarily attacked. Those two visions of how people should work together were fundamentally incompatible, and one had to win. Thank goodness the right one did, and thank goodness someone with Eastwood's integrity and influence was there to make sure it happened. So hit that subscribe button right now if you want more stories like this. Stories that show you how real power works, how integrity can triumph over arrogance, and how standing up for what's right can create change that goes far beyond any single moment. Share this story with people who need to hear it. People who might be facing disrespect in their own workplaces. People who need to be reminded that doing the right thing matters even when it's difficult. Leave a comment telling us about times you've seen someone stand up for what's right despite the personal cost, or times when you've had to make that choice yourself. The Clint Eastwood and Marcus Lieberman confrontation might seem like just another Hollywood story, but it's really a lesson about character, integrity, respect, and courage that applies to every single one of us. It shows that you don't have to tolerate disrespect, that standing up for others is a powerful form of leadership, that real authority comes from how you treat people over time rather than from titles or contracts, and that doing the right thing, even when it's inconvenient or costly, can create positive change that ripples outward in ways you never could have predicted. The next time you see someone being treated disrespectfully, remember Clint Eastwood calmly removing his microphone and walking off that set. Remember that silence is complicity, that passive observation is often just cowardice dressed up as neutrality. You might not have Eastwood's leverage or his decades of earned respect, but you have your voice, your principles, and your choice about what kind of person you're going to be and what kind of world you're going to help create. And remember what happened to Marcus Lieberman, how his moment of ego-driven disrespect destroyed his career, cost him his reputation, and marked him forever as someone who couldn't handle the responsibility that came with his position. That's the cautionary tale for anyone who thinks power means you can treat people however you want. Real power comes with responsibility, and the moment you abuse it is the moment you begin losing it. Subscribe to this channel right now, because we're committed to bringing you these stories that matter, these moments that reveal how change happens and how integrity wins in the long run. We're not here for shallow gossip or meaningless drama. We're here for the stories that teach, inspire, and remind us what's worth fighting for. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we drop new content, and share this video with everyone who needs to hear about Clint Eastwood's masterclass in standing up for what's right. This is the kind of story that changes how you think about power, respect, and courage, and everyone deserves to hear it.